A Wild West story of love, sacrifice, and courage. The desert sun blazed mercilessly overhead, as 17-year-old Alara Whitmore stood defiant in the center of Broken Creek's dusty Main Street, her faded calico dress whipping in the hot wind. Sheriff Hawkins and his men surrounded her in a loose circle, their faces hard as the rocky mesa that loomed over their dying town. "You'll do as you're told, girl," Hawkins growled, his hand resting on the pearl handle of his Colt .45, "or you'll find yourself with nowhere to call home." Alara's emerald eyes flashed with a fire that rivaled the desert sun. "I won't be your bait," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I won't lure innocent people to their deaths." The sheriff's weathered face twisted into a cruel smile. "Innocent? Those savages killed my brother last month. They're nothing but animals, and you're going to help us trap them, or so help me God, I'll leave you out there to die." But Alara had already made her choice. She had seen too much death, too much hatred in this God-forsaken town. As an orphan who had survived on scraps of kindness and stolen moments of tenderness, she knew the difference between love and vengeance, and she would not be the instrument of either man's destruction. "Then leave me," she whispered, and turned her back on the only home she had ever known. 3 hours later, as the unforgiving sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, Alara stumbled through the endless expanse of sagebrush and red dirt, her lips already cracked and bleeding from thirst. The men of Broken Creek had made good on their threat, dumping her miles from town with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of their betrayal in her mouth. She had been barely 5 years old when the cholera outbreak claimed her parents, leaving her at the mercy of a town that saw orphans as burdens rather than children. For 12 years, she had swept floors, mended clothes, and endured the casual cruelty of people who fed her just enough to keep her working, but never enough to make her feel wanted. The only kindness she had known came from an unexpected source: Running Bear, a Lakota warrior who would sometimes trade at the general store. While other townspeople spat and cursed when he appeared, Alara had watched him with curious eyes. He moved with a grace that spoke of ancient wisdom, and when their eyes met across the cramped store, she saw something she had never seen before: recognition, not of her servitude, but of her humanity. Once, when she was 14 and nursing a black eye from Mrs. Henderson's backhand, Running Bear had approached her behind the store. Without words, he had pressed a small carved wooden bird into her palm, a swallow in flight, its wings spread wide in eternal freedom. She had treasured that carving, hidden it beneath her thin mattress, and dreamed of the day she too might spread her wings and fly. Now, as the desert wind howled around her and the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Alara reached into her pocket and felt the smooth wood of that little bird. Even in her darkest hour, it reminded her that kindness existed in the world, that not all hearts were hardened by hatred, but kindness would not save her from the desert night. Chapter 2: The Hunt Begins. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Alara collapsed beside a cluster of barrel cacti, her legs finally giving way beneath her. The temperature was already dropping, and she knew that what the desert heat couldn't kill, the cold would finish by dawn. She had heard the stories. Travelers found weeks later, mummified by the dry air, their faces frozen in silent screams. She closed her eyes and pressed her face against her knees, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in her body. The carved swallow seemed to pulse with its own heat against her palm, and she found herself thinking not of her impending death, but of the man who had carved it. Running Bear had kind eyes, deep brown like rich earth after rain. She had seen him watching her sometimes, and there had been something in his gaze that made her heart flutter in ways she didn't understand. When the other townspeople called him savage and murderer, she had seen only gentleness in the way he handled the trading goods, only wisdom in the way he spoke softly to his horse. The townspeople wanted to use her to lure him and his band into an ambush. They knew he had shown her kindness, and they planned to exploit that compassion. They would have her wander near the tribal hunting grounds, appear lost and helpless, and when the warriors came to her aid, Sheriff Hawkins and his men would be waiting with rifles and rope. "Over my dead body," she whispered into the desert wind, and meant it literally. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her heart race. For a moment hope flared in her chest. Perhaps someone from town had come to their senses, realized that leaving a young woman to die was too extreme even for their hardened hearts. But as the riders approached, she realized they were not coming from the direction of Broken Creek. Chapter 3: Shadows in the Starlight. The horsemen emerged from the darkness like ghosts materialized from desert dreams. There were 5 of them, their faces hidden behind traditional war paint and feathered masks that caught the moonlight. Their horses moved with the fluid silence of creatures born to this harsh land, and Alara felt her breath catch in her throat. She should have been terrified. Every story she had ever heard about savage war parties flashed through her mind, tales of scalping and torture, of white women carried off never to be seen again. But as the lead rider dismounted and approached her with measured steps, she felt not fear but a strange sense of inevitability. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a warrior's confidence, but there was something familiar in his gait. When he knelt beside her and gently lifted her chin with leather-gloved fingers, she gasped. Even behind the ceremonial mask, she knew those eyes. "Running Bear," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. He reached up and slowly removed the eagle feather mask, revealing the face she had memorized in stolen glances across the general store. His expression was grave, but his eyes held a warmth that seemed to melt the ice forming in her veins. "I have been tracking you for hours, Little Swallow," he said, using a name she had never heard before but somehow knew was meant for her. "When we saw the dust clouds of horses leaving town, we knew something was wrong." "We?" she asked, glancing at the other masked riders who sat silent and watchful on their mounts. "My brothers," Running Bear explained. "We have been watching Broken Creek for weeks, ever since we heard whispers of a trap. We know what they planned to do, how they wanted to use your goodness against us." Ilara's heart clenched. "You knew, and you still came." Running Bear's calloused hand brushed a tear from her cheek that she hadn't realized had fallen. "We came because we knew you would refuse them. We came because a heart like yours should not die alone in the desert." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. These men, these supposed savages, had risked their lives not to fall into a trap, but to save the very person who was meant to bait it. They had seen her character more clearly than the people who had raised her. Chapter 4. The Price of Choosing Love. Running Bear lifted Ilara onto his horse with the care one might show a wounded bird. She settled against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his beaded vest, and for the first time in her life she felt truly safe. As they rode through the star-drunk desert toward the distant glow of the Lakota camp, Running Bear told her the story she had never heard, the real story behind the escalating violence between his people and the town of Broken Creek. "It began with water," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The stream that runs past your town, it is sacred to us, the place where our ancestors first settled in this land. For generations we shared it peacefully with the early settlers. But when the silver mine opened last year, they began poisoning the water with their mining waste." Ilara remembered the strange taste the water had developed, how Mrs. Henderson had complained about the livestock growing sick. "My people asked for a meeting," Running Bear continued. "We wanted to find a solution that would allow both our peoples to prosper. But Sheriff Hawkins refused to listen. Instead, he accused us of trying to drive out the miners. When my cousin Little Fox went to speak with him under a flag of truce, Hawkins shot him dead in the street." "Oh God," Ilara breathed. She remembered that day, the commotion in the street, the way the sheriff had strutted around afterward, boasting about sending a message to the Red Devils. Little Fox was to be married the next month. Running Bear's voice grew thick with grief. "His intended bright morning still waits for him to return from a journey that will never end." The raid on the mining camp was not savagery, it was justice, but justice and revenge looked the same to those who refused to see the difference. As they crested a low hill, the Lakota camp spread before them like something from a dream. Dozens of teepees dotted the valley floor, their buffalo hide walls glowing golden from the fires within. The smell of sage and wood smoke filled the air, and Ilara could hear the soft murmur of voices, the gentle laughter of children, the ancient songs of a people who had learned to find joy even in exile. "This is not what I expected," she admitted, watching as families gathered around cook fires, as mothers nursed babies and elders told stories to wide-eyed children. "What did you expect?" Running Bear asked, though his tone held no judgment. "Monsters," she said honestly. "That's what they always called you, monsters and savages." Running Bear's laugh was sad but not bitter. "It is easier to kill monsters than men. Easier to steal from savages than from people who love their children as much as you love yours." Chapter 5. Two Worlds Colliding. The entrance of the white woman into the Lakota camp caused a stir, but not the kind Ilara had expected. Instead of hostile stares or threats, she found herself surrounded by curious faces, women who offered her water from beautifully crafted gourds, children who peeked at her from behind their mothers' skirts, elders who nodded approvingly at Running Bear's explanation of her rescue. Bright Morning, the woman whose intended had been murdered by Sheriff Hawkins, approached with blankets and warm food. Her face bore the marks of grief, deep lines around her eyes, a permanent sadness in her smile, but her hands were gentle as she helped Ilara change into clean clothes and tended to her desert-burned skin. "You chose to die rather than betray us," Bright Morning said as she braided healing herbs into Ilara's hair. "Little Fox would have honored your courage." Through the long night, as Ilara sat by the central fire and listened to the stories of Running Bear's people, she began to understand the true scope of the tragedy unfolding around Broken Creek. These were not the mindless raiders of Sheriff Hawkins' propaganda, but a people fighting for survival against encroachment, poison, and broken promises. But more than that, she began to understand the depth of the choice she had made. By refusing to serve as bait, she had not only saved lives, she had preserved something precious and rare in a world growing increasingly hardened by hatred. She had chosen love over fear, humanity over tribal loyalty. Running Bear sat beside her as the fire burned low, and when their eyes met across the dancing flames, she saw her own emotions reflected in his gaze. What had begun as distant admiration across a crowded general store had deepened into something neither of them had dared to name. "I cannot go back," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Would you want to?" he asked. She thought of Mrs. Henderson's sharp tongue, of the sheriff's cruel smile, of the endless days of thankless labor and nights of loneliness. Then she looked around at the faces surrounding the fire, people who had welcomed her not as a servant or a burden, but as a person worthy of rescue and respect. "No," she said, "but I don't know if I can stay either. Your people have been kind, but I'm not one of you. I don't know your ways, your language, your customs." Running Bear reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Love teaches us new languages," he said. "If you are willing to learn, there are many here who would be honored to teach you." Chapter 6. The Morning After. Dawn came softly to the Lakota camp, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost too beautiful for a world that harbored so much hatred. Ilara woke in bright morning's teepee, wrapped in buffalo robes that smelled of sage and sweetgrass, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The confrontation in Broken Creek, the long walk through the desert, the miraculous rescue by the very people she had refused to betray. She sat up slowly, her body still aching from yesterday's ordeal, and found Bright Morning preparing breakfast over a small fire. "The Council of Elders wishes to speak with you," Bright Morning said without preamble. "They must decide what to do about your presence here." Ilara's heart sank. Of course they couldn't simply accept her. She was, after all, one of the people who had been trying to destroy them. Her very presence put the entire camp at risk. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll go wherever they think is best." Bright Morning looked at her with something like surprise. "You would not fight to stay, even though Running Bear has claimed you as his heart friend." The words sent a shock through Ilara's system. "It is what he called you when he requested permission to bring you into the camp. It is not a word we use lightly." The Council of Elders met in the largest teepee at the center of the camp. Ilara knelt on a woven mat before 5 weathered faces that had seen decades of war, peace, love, and loss. Their eyes held the wisdom of people who had learned to read the true hearts of others, and she felt exposed under their collective gaze. The eldest, a woman whose gray hair fell to her waist in intricate braids, spoke first. "Running Bear has told us of your courage, White Swallow. He says you chose death rather than betrayal. This is the act of an honorable person. But," added another elder, his voice grave, "your presence here puts us all in danger. If the soldiers come looking for you, they will use it as an excuse to attack our camp. Many innocents could die for your choice." Ilara's throat tightened. She had not considered this consequence of her rescue. In her relief at being saved, she had not thought about the risk to her rescuers. "Then I should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't be the cause of more death." "Where would you go?" asked the eldest woman. "You cannot return to your town, and you know nothing of surviving alone in the wilderness." It was Running Bear who answered, stepping into the teepee with the confidence of a respected warrior. "She would go with me," he said. "Far from here, to a place where neither of our people's conflicts can follow us." The elders exchanged glances, and Ilara saw a communication pass between them that she could not interpret. "You would abandon your people for this woman?" the eldest asked. Running Bear's jaw tightened. "I would not abandon them, but I would build a new life with someone who has proven her heart is larger than the hatred that divides our worlds." Chapter 7. The Choice That Changes Everything. The debate that followed revealed the true complexity of the situation. Running Bear was not just any warrior. He was the nephew of the chief, a war leader whose skills and judgment were crucial to the tribe's survival. For him to leave now, as tensions with Broken Creek reached a breaking point, would be seen as desertion by some and wisdom by others. Ilara listened to the rapid exchange in Lakota, understanding none of the words but grasping the emotions behind them. Some voices were raised in anger. Others spoke with measured calm. Through it all, Running Bear stood straight and proud, defending his choice with the same courage he would show facing enemy rifles. Finally, the eldest woman raised her hand for silence. "White Swallow," she said, turning to Ilara, "you have brought a difficult choice to our lodge. Running Bear is precious to us, as precious as our own children. If he leaves with you, it will weaken us at a time when we need all our strength. But if he stays and you are discovered here, it could mean war that destroys us all." Ilara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Every choice seemed to lead to suffering for people who had shown her nothing but kindness. There is another way, she said suddenly, the words forming even as the idea crystallized in her mind. What if I went back? The teepee fell silent. Running Bear stared at her, as if she had suggested walking into fire. Back to Broken Creek, he asked. They left you to die. They will kill you for what you know. Not if I give them what they want, Ilara said, her voice growing stronger as the plan took shape. Not if I tell them I escaped and found their camp. Not if I lead them into a trap of our own making. The eldest woman leaned forward, her ancient eyes sharp with interest. Explain. Ilara's heart hammered as she outlined her desperate plan. She would return to Broken Creek, claim she had escaped from a war party that had captured her. She would tell Sheriff Hawkins that she had overheard the location of the main camp and offer to lead them there. But instead of leading them to the real camp, she would guide them into the Box Canyon 3 miles south, a dead end with steep walls and only one way out. The warriors could be waiting in the rocks above, she explained. When the sheriff and his men realize they've been led into a trap, they'll be surrounded. You could capture them, use them as bargaining chips to negotiate a real peace. And if the plan fails? Running Bear asked, his voice tight with concern. If they suspect you and kill you before you can lead them anywhere. Ilara met his eyes across the flickering fire. Then at least I'll die knowing I tried to save both our peoples from more bloodshed. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of momentous decision. Finally, the eldest woman spoke. It is a brave plan, she admitted. But the risk to you is great. Why would you take such a chance for people you barely know? Ilara looked around the circle of faces. Weathered, wise, marked by struggle, but not hardened by hatred. These people had accepted her when her own people had cast her out. They had seen her worth when others saw only a burden. Because love is not about knowing someone for a long time, she said. It's about recognizing the goodness in their hearts, the moment you see it. Chapter 8. The Return. 2 days later, Ilara stumbled into Broken Creek at dawn, her clothes torn and her face streaked with dirt and tears that were not entirely feigned. The performance had to be perfect. Her terror genuine enough to convince men who had known her since childhood. Mrs. Henderson found her collapsed by the water trough, babbling about warriors and capture, escape and pursuit. Within minutes, Sheriff Hawkins was crouched beside her, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a hunter who scents blood. "Slow down, girl," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "Tell me what happened." Ilara's story poured out in halting gasps, each detail crafted to feed the sheriff's preconceptions and prejudices. She told him about being taken by a war party, about overhearing their plans, about their secret camp hidden in the red rocks where they felt safe from white man's justice. How many of them? Hawkins demanded. Maybe 20 warriors, she lied smoothly. But they're not expecting trouble. They think they're too well hidden. The sheriff's weathered face split into a grin that held no warmth. Well, they're about to learn different. "Boys," he shouted to his deputies, "get the men together. We're going hunting." As the town erupted into preparations for war, Eliza felt the weight of what she had set in motion. In less than 24 hours, she would be leading these men to what she prayed would be their capture rather than their deaths. The plan had to work. Too many lives hung in the balance for her to accept failure. That night, as she lay in the same attic room where she had spent so many years dreaming of freedom, Eliza clutched the carved swallow and whispered prayers to any god who might be listening. Tomorrow would bring either peace or catastrophe, and she was the fulcrum on which the balance would tip. Chapter 9. The Canyon of Truth. The Box Canyon lay before them like an open grave carved into the red earth by ancient waters. Sheriff Hawkins and his 12 men followed Ilara along the narrow trail that led into its depths, their rifles ready and their eyes scanning the rim for signs of movement. "You sure about this, girl?" Hawkins muttered, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This looks like a perfect place for an ambush." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "They're deeper in," she said, "around the next bend. They think no one knows about this place." What the sheriff didn't know was that Lakota warriors had been moving into position since before dawn, hidden among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the canyon rim. Running Bear was up there somewhere, watching her lead his enemies into the carefully prepared trap. The thought of his presence gave her strength. As they rounded the final bend and came face to face with the canyon's dead end, Sheriff Hawkins pulled up short. "There's nothing here," he growled, suspicion creeping into his voice. That was when the first war cry echoed from the rocks above. The sheriff's men spun in circles, rifles raised, as painted warriors rose from concealment all around the canyon rim. In the space of a heartbeat, they went from hunters to hunted, surrounded by the very people they had come to destroy. "Drop your weapons," Running Bear's voice boomed from the canyon wall, speaking English for the benefit of the trapped men. "You are surrounded. Surrender, and no one needs to die today." Sheriff Hawkins' face went purple with rage as he realized the truth. "You treacherous little bitch," he snarled, spinning to face Ilara with his gun raised. "You led us into a trap. I led you into a chance for peace, Alara said, standing her ground even as the sheriff's pistol barrel found her chest. Drop your weapons, and we can all walk out of here alive. Like hell we will, Hawkins spat. You think I'm going to let a bunch of savages and their white whore dictate terms to me? The slur hit Running Bear like a physical blow. Even from 50 feet above, Alara could see the rage that flashed across his painted face. But instead of the violent response the sheriff clearly expected, Running Bear's voice when he spoke again was calm and controlled. You have 1 minute to decide, he called down. Surrender your weapons, and you will be treated with honor. Refuse, and you will share the fate you planned for us. Chapter 10, The Moment of Truth. The standoff lasted an eternity that was probably only seconds. Sheriff Hawkins' men looked around at the warriors positioned above them, calculating odds that any fool could see were hopeless. One by one, they began to lower their rifles. Stand fast, Hawkins roared. I'm not surrendering to no red devils. But his men had already made their choice. Survival trumped loyalty, and they could see as clearly as anyone that their sheriff's pride was about to get them all killed. We surrender, called out Deputy Martinez, dropping his rifle and raising his hands. We surrender. The other men quickly followed suit, until only Sheriff Hawkins stood defiant with his gun trained on Alara's heart. You're going to die for this, he told her, his finger tightening on the trigger. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. That was when Alara made her final choice, the one that would define not just her own fate, but the future of two peoples balanced on the knife's edge of war. Then kill me, she said, stepping closer to the gun instead of away from it. Kill me, and prove to everyone watching that you're exactly the kind of man who would murder an unarmed woman. Show them that all your talk of civilization and justice is just words used to justify hatred. Sheriff Hawkins' hand began to tremble. Around the canyon, the silence was so complete that the sound of his labored breathing seemed to fill the space between the walls. Or, Alara continued, her voice growing stronger, put down your gun and be the man you claim to be. Be the kind of leader who chooses his people's lives over his own pride. For a moment that stretched like a held breath. It could have gone either way. Then, slowly, Sheriff Hawkins' arm began to lower. Damn you, he whispered, letting the pistol fall from his fingers. Damn you to hell. Chapter 11. The Price of Peace. The negotiations that followed took place not in the canyon, but in a neutral meadow halfway between Broken Creek and the Lakota camp. Sheriff Hawkins and his men were released unharmed, their weapons returned to them, but the message was clear. The balance of power had shifted. Running Bear, speaking as war leader for his people, outlined the terms for peace. The silver mine would be relocated away from the sacred stream, or new methods would be found to prevent the poisoning of the water. Compensation would be paid for the death of Little Fox, and safe passage would be guaranteed for Lakota traders in the town. In return, the Lakota would cease their raids on mining operations and would provide scouts to help protect the town from the Apache bands that had been moving through the territory. And what about her? Sheriff Hawkins asked, nodding toward Alara, who stood between the two groups like a bridge spanning troubled waters. She has made her choice, Running Bear replied. She is no longer your concern. But Alara stepped forward before the sheriff could respond. Actually, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air, I have a different proposal. Both groups turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. The words she spoke next would ripple out from this moment, like stones dropped in still water, changing everything they touched. I propose to stay in Broken Creek, she said, ignoring the gasps of surprise from both sides. Not as I was before, but as a translator and mediator between our peoples. If this peace is going to last, both sides need someone they can trust to carry messages and settle disputes before they become wars. Sheriff Hawkins looked stunned. You want to come back? After what we did to you? I want to build something better than what came before, Alara replied. Hatred is easy. Peace takes work. Every single day. Someone has to do that work. Running Bear stepped toward her, and she saw the pain in his eyes. You would give up your chance at happiness for people who cast you out? Alara reached out and took his hand, not caring who saw the gesture or what they might think of it. I'm not giving up my chance at happiness, she said. I'm choosing a different kind of happiness, the kind that comes from building something larger than yourself. Chapter 12. Love Transcendent. The months that followed were not easy. Alara took up residence in a small cabin on the outskirts of Broken Creek, funded by contributions from both communities who had begun to see the value of her work. She spent her days riding between the town and the Lakota camp, carrying messages, translating not just languages but entire ways of seeing the world. There were setbacks, men on both sides who saw her efforts as betrayal, moments when the fragile peace almost shattered under the weight of old grievances and new misunderstandings. But slowly, impossibly, trust began to grow. The silver mine was relocated, and new methods were found to process the ore without poisoning the stream. Lakota hunters began selling meat to the town's butcher shop, while the town's doctor was called upon to treat wounded warriors with the same care he showed white patients, and through it all, Running Bear courted her with a patience that spoke of understanding deeper than passion. He brought her wild flowers from the high meadows and taught her the Lakota words for hope, courage, and love. She shared with him the stories of her childhood, the dreams she had carried through years of servitude, the wonder she felt at discovering that her heart was large enough to hold an entire world. Their wedding, when it finally came, was unlike anything either community had ever seen. It took place at the neutral meadow where the peace had been negotiated, with representatives from both peoples standing witness. Bright morning wove flowers into Alara's hair, while Mrs. Henderson, who had slowly, grudgingly come to respect the young woman she had once dismissed, helped her into a dress that combined white lace with traditional Lakota beadwork. Sheriff Hawkins himself walked her down the aisle, an act of redemption that spoke to the transformative power of choosing love over hatred. Epilogue: The Legacy of Choice. Years later, when Alara's hair had begun to show silver threads and her face bore the lines of a life fully lived, she would sit on the porch of the house she and Running Bear had built at the very spot where the peace treaty was signed. Their children, 3 daughters and 2 sons who moved easily between 2 worlds, would gather around her feet as she told them the story of the choice that changed everything. "The townspeople called me a traitor," she would say, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Your father's people called me an outsider, but love doesn't recognize the borders we draw around our hearts. It doesn't ask permission to bloom in impossible places." The little town of Broken Creek had grown into a thriving community, where Lakota children attended school alongside white children, where the general store carried traditional medicines next to patent remedies, where the church bell rang on Sunday mornings while the ancient songs of the Lakota rose from the ceremonial grounds on the hill. It was not a perfect world. There were still those who harbored old prejudices, still moments when the peace seemed fragile as morning frost. But it was a world where children could grow up without learning to hate the color of another's skin, where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where love had proven stronger than the forces that sought to divide. On the night before her 70th birthday, as Alara lay in the arms of the man who had risked everything to save her from the desert, she felt the carved wooden swallow that still rested on her nightstand. The bird's wings were worn smooth by decades of her fingers tracing their surface, but the symbol remained as powerful as ever. Freedom, she had learned, was not about flying away from responsibility, but about choosing which responsibilities were worth embracing. Love was not about finding someone who shared your world, but about building a new world together. And courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act with kindness even when everything around you whispered that hatred was easier. In the end, that was the message she left for her children and grandchildren, for the community that had grown up around her choices, for anyone who would listen. Love transcends all boundaries, not by ignoring them, but by transforming them into bridges. The greatest act of rebellion against a world that profits from division is the simple, radical choice to see the humanity in everyone you meet. And sometimes, if you're very brave and very lucky, that choice doesn't just change your own life. Sometimes it changes everything. The desert wind still whispers through the sagebrush around what was once Broken Creek, but is now known as Harmony Ridge. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can still hear the echo of a choice that proved love truly can conquer all, not through force or conquest, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to let hatred have the final word.